Well, welcome back to Whole Bible Study with me, Taddy Noy. Now, in this study today, we're going to do a topic study. We're going to do a deep dive into the central religious question that has plagued every Christian and potentially every Christian in history. Was Jesus a real historical figure? Did he really die and did he really come back to life? These are fair questions because the answers matters. If Jesus was just a legend, then all our theological reflection becomes abstract at best. But if he actually lived, taught, and interacted with people in the first century, then the conversation changes. It becomes not just about belief, but about history, events that happened in real place, in real time. So let's start here. Nearly every professional historian of antiquity, whether Christian, Jewish, secular, or agnostic, agrees that Jesus actually existed. Bart Ehrman, who's not exactly known for defending evangelical claims, says, quote, "He certainly existed as virtually every competent scholar of antiquity, Christian or non-Christian, agrees," unquote. Richard Burridge echoes this, quote, "I do not know any respectable critical scholar who says Jesus didn't exist," unquote. And James Dunn called the idea that Jesus never lived, quote, "a thoroughly dead thesis." In other words, it's not even on the scholarly table anymore. So now, why such confidence? Well, we have multiple independent sources. Let's start outside the Bible. Around the year 116 AD, the Roman historian Tacitus refers to Christus, who suffered under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. Tacitus was no friend to Christianity. He had nothing to gain from mention in it. So his words carry weight. Then there's Josephus, the Jewish historian writing in late first century. In Antiquities, he mentions Jesus and James, quote, the brother of Jesus. Yes, the, quote, testimonium, Flavinium, was later Christian additions, has later Christian additions, but the majority of scholars agree that there's a solid core reference to Jesus there. And then even earlier, we have Paul's letters written within 20 to 25 years of Jesus' death, where he names James, Peter, and other eyewitnesses. That's historically close by ancient standards. So the evidence isn't just, quote, church tradition. It's Roman, Jewish, and Christian testimonies converging. So now, beginning in the 18th century, scholars launched what they called, quote, the quest for the historical Jesus, unquote. The idea was, can we use the tools of historical inquiry to sift through the layers of tradition and get closer to what Jesus actually was, who Jesus actually was? Now, Albert Schweitzer, famous 1906 book, The Quest for the Historical Jesus, shifted the conversation by criticizing earlier romanticized portraits. Fast forward to the late 20th century, and you have major voices like John Dominic Crossan, James Dunn, E.P. Sanders, and N.T. Wright, Marcus Borg, each painting a different portrait of Jesus based on the same historical canvas. And while they disagree on details, they do agree on some anchors. Jesus was a Jewish teacher, baptized by John the Baptist. He gathered followers, taught about the kingdom of God, clashed with authorities, and was crucified under Pontius Pilate. Those are the bedrock points. Now let's meet two of the most interesting voices in this field, Dom Crossan, and Marcus Borg. Crossan is one of the founders of the Jesus Seminar, which evaluated the sayings and deeds of Jesus with the critical historical lens. He sees Jesus not as an apocalyptic doomsday prophet, but as a sage healer, a radical peasant who used free healing and open meals to dismantle the social hierarchies of his time. Think about that. In a society where meals were segregated by class, purity, and gender, Jesus invites everyone to the table, to the same table. It wasn't just hospitality, it was a social revolution. Crossan even calls some of the gospel stories, quote, mega parables, not literal blow-by-blow accounts, but narrative vehicles for life-changing truth. For him, Jesus is the founder of a radically inclusive community that challenged both Jewish religious boundaries and Roman imperial order. Then there's Marcus Borg. And side note, Marcus Borg was one of my major professors in college. So before he died, so I have a fondness for him and his perspective and his work. But then there's Marcus Borg, also part of the Jesus Seminar, but his emphasis is different. Mark gives us a, quote, third way between the purely apocalyptic prophet and the purely divine Christ of traditional theology. He calls Jesus a wisdom teacher and mystic, someone deeply rooted in Jewish tradition, but whose teaching transcends it with a radical compassion and spiritual depth. Now for Borg, the kingdom of God isn't just a future hope. It's a present reality you can step into right now through transformed relationships, justice, and love. He often compared Jesus to figures like Buddha, teachers who break open the human heart and subvert cultural norms to lead us towards a deeper life with God. And Borg emphasizes that the Christian life is first and foremost about relationship, entering into a way of being that begins to change everything here and now. So now these two scholars, Crossan and Borg, don't agree on everything. Crossan leans towards social ethics, Jesus as a community organizer in the spirit. Borg leans towards inner transformation, Jesus as the doorway to mystical union with God. But both agree that Jesus' message was about life here and now, not just life after death. And both see him as challenging the purity system, rejecting violence, and modeling radical compassion. This makes the portraits deeply relevant for how we live our faith today. Of course, there are other voices. N.T. Wright and E.P. Sanders still emphasize that Jesus saw himself as a part of an apocalyptic movement, expecting Jesus' decisive action to come soon. So is Jesus a sage healer, the mystic, or an apocalyptic prophet? Well, maybe the answer is yes. In different ways, it's possible he integrated elements of each. That's why the scholarly conversation is so rich. It's not about one right answer, but a mosaic of perspectives that together give us a fuller picture. Now, what about those who say Jesus never existed? These so-called mythicists. They argue Jesus was purely a literary creation, a myth modeled on other dying and rising gods. But here's the thing. Among professional historians and biblical scholars, mysticism is fringe. Ehrman, again, not a conservative, calls it amateurish and lacking in historical method. The convergence of multiple independent sources, including hostile witnesses, makes the myth theory historically implausible. So even skeptics who reject miracles still affirm that Jesus of Nazareth walked this earth. Here's why all this matters for us. If we reduce Jesus to only an apocalyptic preacher, we might miss his wisdom teaching and his radical hospitality. If we see him only as a mystic, we might forget his prophetic challenge to unjust systems. If we focus only on the healer, we might miss the spiritual depth behind his works. The richness is in the whole portrait. Jesus as healer, mystic, prophet, and sage all at once. And each of those dimensions still calls us into action today, to heal, to love, to stand for justice, and to seek God deeply. So after hearing the evidence, Tacitus, Josephus, Pauline letters, the Gospels, there's really no serious doubt that Jesus lived and died under Pontius Pilate. The real question is, who was he? What was his mission? And how does that mission continue in us? For me, the portraits of Crossan and Borg are not mutually exclusive. They're lenses through which I can see a fuller, more human, more compelling Jesus. A Jesus who welcomes the outcast to dinner. A Jesus who offers wisdom, that awakens the soul. A Jesus who stands against the empire and calls us to a new kind of kingdom. That's the Jesus I want to know, and that's the Jesus I want to follow. And I'll leave you with this. Which Jesus do you see most clearly? The mystic, the sage, the prophet, or the healer? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And as always, thank you for joining me on this journey of discovery. Let's keep asking the hard questions, holding them with love and faith, and walking this road together. Thank you again for this topic discussion on Jesus. Was he a real figure in history? And we'll see. And I have a part 2 of this coming up as well. So stay tuned for part 2. Thank you again, and we'll see you in the next chapter.